She only wanted to get home. But 10 minutes after being escorted off a plane, the runway was shut down, and the world would never see her the same way again. Imagine this. You've worked your whole life to earn respect. You've built a company, inspired hundreds of people. And yet, one quiet morning, a stranger decides that you don't belong in the seat you paid for. What would you do? Would you fight back and make a scene, or would you stay calm, knowing that silence can sometimes shake the world louder than anger ever could? This is a story of Dr. Aisha Monroe, a black female CEO whose dignity was mistaken for defiance and whose calm changed everything. But what really happened on Flight 827 that day? Why did the runway stop for her, and how did that moment spark a movement that made airlines rewrite their rules? If you were her, sitting in that seat, with hundreds of eyes on you, and no one speaking up, what would you have done? Take a breath. Feel that question. Because this story isn't just about one woman, it's about all of us, about what happens when respect, race, and courage collide at 30,000 feet. So stay with me, because by the end of this story, you might see silence differently. If you believe stories can change hearts, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because what happens next will make you think twice about what it truly means to stand your ground, even when you're sitting still. Ascend. Air Flight 827 from Atlanta glides down the runway, ready for the 4-plus-hour journey to Los Angeles. The first-class cabin, with its soft lighting and soft brown leather seats, exudes a sense of serenity and comfort. The gleaming windows reflect the pale gray sky, and the scent of roasted coffee wafts in the air, mixed with the light floral scent of the warm towels served to each passenger. For anyone who steps into this cabin, it is a place to relax, to feel important, to feel appreciated, but for Dr. Aisha Monroe, 48. This was just a quiet space, a private moment to prepare her mind for the stressful work week. Aisha didn't need the admiring gaze of others. Her silver-streaked hair was neatly tied back, her bespoke charcoal gray suit was fitted to her body, and noise-canceling headphones covered her ears, creating an invisible wall between her and the outside world. She placed her hands on the chair controls, let out a soft breath, and felt the firm feel of the chair under her back and ribs. Everything was as planned. Aisha Monroe is not one to be cowed. She has stood before boards, CEOs, FAA officials, defending technical decisions, sometimes under skeptical eyes because of her race and gender. At this moment, in the first-class cabin of an Airbus A380, she just wanted to relax, to watch the clouds drift beneath her wings and let the pressure flow. She pressed the button to raise her seat to the most comfortable position. Her eyes turned to the window. The late afternoon light filtered through the clouds, golden the giant Rolls-Royce Trent 900's engine blades, and reflected off the delicate dashboard of her seat. Aisha closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the wind rushing past the window and the gentle hum of the engine, like peaceful notes, before touching the chaotic world outside. She knew this week would be a tough one. Meetings with big CEOs, airline safety inspections, important decisions about the company she led all awaited her. But at this moment, she was just a passenger temporarily removed from all responsibility. This calmness was her power, a power no one could see right away, but enough to change how the world around her reacted to her. Inside the cabin, other passengers were settling into their seats. There was soft laughter, the sound of suitcase wheels rolling across the floor, and the soft sound of pouring water. Some were reading newspapers, others checking their phones. The pace of life seemed to slow down. Aisha scanned the passengers, not judging, just observing. She saw curious glances, a few glances that she ignored. This was her moment. She pressed a button on the control panel to raise the tray table, placing the book on it, a text on aviation risk management she had read many times. She opened it, but didn't read it right away. Instead, she took a deep breath, feeling the safety and quiet of seat 2B. It was a seat she had chosen months ago, after studying the window position, the direction of light, and the distance to the aisle. Every detail meant something to her, and she wasn't about to give it up for anyone. Aisha Monroe doesn't like to argue, but she knows the value of consistency. Early in her career, she learned that sometimes a quiet calm is more powerful than any yelling or violent action. It's an invisible, yet terrifying weapon, just as she put the book down on the table. Ready to immerse herself in the world of words and theories, a figure appeared in the passage. A deep, urgent voice cut through the quiet space. "Excuse me," a man said, his voice as sharp as paper. Aisha opened her eyes. The man was around 38 years old, wearing a slightly wrinkled charcoal suit, his expression showing haste and self-righteousness. He pointed to his seat 3C, then turned to the seat next to Aisha, 2A, where a young woman was packing her things. "My colleague and I need to discuss our presentation," he said. "Not asking, but ordering. You'll need to move." Aisha turned off her headphones, put her hands on the table, looked at him, looked at the boarding pass, then looked back at him. Her voice was calm but firm. "I'm sorry, sir. This is my assigned seat." The man grimaced, his face beginning to redden. Aisha immediately recognized the sign of self-righteousness, and she prepared for the first test. At this moment, the first-class cabin was still quiet on the outside, but inside there was a simmering tension that Aisha had learned to read like the numbers on the plane's dashboard. James Whitmore stood in the middle of the aisle, hands on hips, eyes trained on Dr. Aisha Monroe. He was not the type to wait patiently, not the type to explain gently. Every word he spoke was a command, and he expected everyone to agree. "My colleague and I really need to sit together," James said urgently. "I need you to move to seat 3C, just for one flight." Aisha Monroe raised an eyebrow, her voice calm but clear. "I'm sorry, sir. This is my assigned seat. I specifically chose this seat months ago, and I'm not moving." The man cocked his head, as if she had just missed the most important thing in the world. "But we have a presentation worth millions," he pressed. "Surely you understand the urgency." She looked at him. Not a trace of fear, but her eyes showed the understanding of someone who had experienced countless stressful situations in her life. "I understand your work is important. My comfort and my plans are also important to me." Such calmness seemed to infuriate James. He cleared his throat and looked around the cabin, seemingly hoping to receive agreement from the other passengers. A few people glanced up from their phones, some muttered quietly, but no one intervened. Emily Carter, James's young colleague, sitting in seat 2A, glanced at her and frowned. "Chad," she whispered, "maybe it's fine. We can just ask someone else." James's voice became more emphatic. "No, Emily, it's not fine. We need to be adjacent." He pointed toward his own seat. "This woman can move to my seat," he insisted, his voice carrying an air of self-righteous authority. Aisha Monroe closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the tension in the cabin, but she remained calm. "I specifically chose this seat, sir," she said evenly. "I am afraid I will not move." James's eyes reddened, his facial muscles starting to tense. "Look, you don't understand. It is important." The man didn't know that her calmness was her most dangerous weapon. "It is important that my comfort and plans are respected as well," Aisha replied. The factual, calm tone of her voice, devoid of any sign of anger, made James lose his balance. A moment later, flight attendant Brenda appeared from the aisle, her face trying to keep a smile, but her eyes couldn't hide her discomfort. "Is there a problem here?" "Sir," she asked, her voice polite, but there was a hint of condescension beneath the soft words. James pointed at Aisha, his mouth blinking as he spoke nonstop. "This woman is refusing to move. I have a seat in the back. It is completely unreasonable." Brenda glanced at Aisha, her smile still there, but her tone had turned childish. "Ma'am," she said, "it would be very helpful if you could just swap seats for a short flight." Aisha Monroe sensed every sound, every gesture, every intention. She had encountered so many Brendas in her life, she thought. People who saw skin before ability. People who thought she was just a passenger, not a seasoned CEO, not the person who had created safety standards for the airline they served. "I'm also a paying passenger in my assigned seat," she said, her voice even clear, unarguing but powerful. "The gentleman may ask his colleague to swap seats if he needs to sit nearby." Brenda glanced at James, as if seeking approval. Her smile began to waver, replaced by a slightly angry look. "Ma'am, we really do not want to cause a scene," she said, trying to explain, but there was already resistance inside. "I have no intention of causing a scene," Aisha said, her tone returning to normal. I simply want to enjoy the seat I paid for." James grimaced, his brows furrowed, his body tensing. He was losing control because he couldn't force her to do what he wanted. Brenda exchanged glances with James, a moment of silent collusion. "I'm going to have to ask you to reconsider," she said, her voice sharper, signaling an escalation. "Aisha Monroe Nadanhanghit Mot Hoy." "No," she said, "this is not going to be a problem for me because I am not moving. You are creating the problem, and I would advise you to think very carefully about your next step. At this moment." James wanted to scream, but the first-class cabin was still silent, only the soft sound of the engine and Aisha's light breathing. Everyone around looked on silently, some confused, some trying to look at their phones to avoid confrontation. Emily Carter looked at Aisha, her eyes wide open, as if she wanted to intervene but was haunted by her boss's authority. Aisha Monroe, still calm, told herself, "I didn't lose my temper. I was just defending my rights. This injustice is not personal. It is a symptom of a system and attitudes that need to change." At this moment, the tension in the first-class cabin reached its peak without exploding. Aisha kept her inner power. James lost his balance. Brenda felt the need to consolidate her power. Emily Carter was caught between fear and admiration. This moment marks the first turning point in the conflict, where the viewer begins to feel the injustice, Aisha's strength, and the subtle but intense escalation to come. Brenda Lawson stepped out of the passenger compartment, her smile still there, but her eyes were no longer gentle. She was a seasoned flight attendant, 25 years in the business, but today she felt something was wrong. She glanced quickly at James Whitmore and Emily Carter, then looked straight at Dr. Aisha Monroe, a woman sitting calmly, her eyes deep but fearless. "Ma'am," Brenda said, her voice trying to keep a light rhythm, "we just want everything to go smoothly. James and Emily need some space to prepare for their presentation." Aisha Monroe looked at her, still calm, her voice steady, as if reciting an undeniable truth. "I understand your concerns, Brenda, but I also have the right to use the seat I reserved. I can't move just to please another passenger." Brenda felt her heart beat faster. She was used to handling difficult situations, but she had never seen anyone face her with such calmness and determination as Aisha. She looked down, trying to maintain a smile, but her lips trembled. Jeffrey Daniels, the flight attendant, appeared beside Brenda. He was a middle-aged man who prided himself on his role as the flight manager. He placed his hand on Brenda's shoulder, signaling that he was in control. Brenda had told her side of the story, and now Jeffrey stood there, ready to back up her story. Dr. Monroe looked at Jeffrey, his voice calm but sharp. "I have done nothing disruptive. I am seated in my assigned seat. That is all." Jeffrey frowned, trying to maintain his authority, but he felt a strange pressure. He realized that she was not like the other passengers, not someone they could force to do their will. Her eyes were deep, penetrating their every intention, their every false pride. James Whitmore shrugged, his face heating up with his loss of control. He wanted Aisha to move, wanted everyone to see his power, but everything seemed to be against him. Emily Carter looked at her boss, a little scared but also beginning to see the justice in Dr. Monroe's words. Brenda Lawson spoke again, trying to contain her nervousness. "Ma'am, we just want to avoid any trouble. A quiet flight is good for everyone." Aisha Monroe shrugged slightly, her tone still gentle but firm. "I have no intention of causing a scene. I simply want to enjoy the seat I paid for." At this moment, James Whitmore felt like his power was gone. He thought that everyone would agree with him just because he was the one giving orders. But facing Dr. Monroe, things were not so simple. Brenda Lawson took a deep breath, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. She knew that if she continued, the situation would escalate. She glanced at Jeffrey Daniels and saw that he was also uncertain. They were facing a passenger whose true power was invisible to the naked eye. Emily Carter looked at Aisha, her eyes filled with surprise and a little admiration. She realized that Dr. Monroe did not lose her temper, nor was she weak. She controlled the situation with calmness and intelligence. Emily felt her heart warm, wondering if she could become so steadfast. James Whitmore threw up his hands, his voice growing harsher. I don't think you understand. It is crucial. Dr. Monroe leaned toward James, her voice steady and calm. I understand perfectly. My plans and my space are equally important. The simple fact made James want to scream. He was struggling between his self-righteous authority and Aisha Monroe's unwavering determination. Brenda Lawson Kogan can Thiep Lan Nua. Ma'am, if you could just move a few rows back, it would really help. Aisha Monroe sighed softly, her eyes glancing out the window for a moment. I am not moving, she said. You are creating the problem, not me. The first-class cabin was silent at this moment. The surrounding passengers were silent, listening, sensing the subtle confrontation that was taking place. They did not dare to look directly at each other. Many bowed their heads to their phones, trying to avoid the tension. Emily Carter, looking at James, realized the truth that she had never thought of before. Dr. Monroe was not just an ordinary passenger. She was someone with experience, with wisdom, with inner power that James and Brenda could not easily overcome. Brenda Lawson finally understood that continuing to pressure Dr. Monroe would not yield any results. Her eyes flashed with worry, revealing a moment of confusion. This moment marks the first escalation in the story. The protagonist remains calm. The climax is brewing, and the audience begins to feel the injustice, the strength of Aisha Monroe, and the first signs of the true power she holds. Sitting on chair 2B, Dr. Monroe closed his eyes for a moment, muttering to himself, I'm not the one creating the conflict. I'm just protecting my own rights, and sometimes just keeping calm will make everything fall into place. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin began to change. The once luxurious silence was now covered with an indescribable tension. The engine noise was still quiet, but everyone could feel the pulse of unease spreading. Jeffrey Daniels, the purser, glanced at Brenda. He understood that if the situation was not controlled now, it could turn into a serious incident, but he also sensed the certainty in Dr. Aisha Monroe's words, a calmness that made even the most powerful people wary. Ma'am, Jeffrey said, his voice low and trying to maintain authority, I am in charge of safety in this cabin. I hear you're refusing to follow the flight attendant's instructions. Dr. Monroe looked at him, her eyes deep and fearless. I didn't refuse any safety instructions, she said. I just refused to be asked to leave a seat I had paid for. Jeffrey pursed his lips, feeling the response hit him where it hurt. He knew she was right, but he also knew that if he didn't act, he would lose control of the situation. Brenda stepped closer, her voice a little firmer. Ma'am, if you don't cooperate, we'll have to call the captain. Aisha Monroe turned her head, calm, as if she'd heard it 1,000 times. Please, do, she said. James Whitmore smirked. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and whispered to Emily Carter, loud enough for others to hear. Finally, someone's going to handle her. Emily looked down. She knew this was going wrong. There was a shame in her eyes that she couldn't hide. A few minutes later, Captain Michael Reynolds emerged from the cockpit. He had the calm demeanor of a man who had flown for decades, but his eyes were filled with frustration at having to leave the command post because of an unpleasant passenger. He stopped in front of Dr. Monroe, his voice low and firm. Ma'am, this is Captain Michael Reynolds. I've been informed that you're causing a disturbance and refusing to comply with crew instructions. The whole compartment was dead silent. All eyes were on them. Aisha raised her head, looking him straight in the eye. I'm not causing trouble. Captain, I'm staying in my seat. I was asked to give up my seat to make way for another passenger, and I refused. Captain Reynolds frowned. He did not like being challenged, especially in front of passengers. You know, he said, that the crew has sole discretion in deciding who is allowed to stay on the plane. I know very well, Aisha replied, her voice so calm it made him uneasy. I wrote the rules for that authority. The cabin was so quiet that one could hear Emily Carter's soft breathing. Captain Reynolds paused, unsure how to respond. He didn't know who she was, and the remark sounded too confident. Jeffrey interjected, trying to regain the initiative. Captain, she's delaying the flight. Aisha looked at him, her eyes not angry, only a deep sadness. I did not delay the flight. It was your unfairness and behavior that did that." Brenda, standing at the back, swallowed. She felt the other passengers' eyes begin to shift toward her. Some looked uncomfortable. Others seemed sympathetic to the woman sitting there. Captain Reynolds folded his arms and spoke slowly. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the plane." A wave of silence spread across the cabin. Emily Carter let out a soft gasp. "Captain, maybe that's not necessary." He turned to her, his voice cold. "Miss, please stay out of this." Aisha took a deep breath, then spoke softly. "Captain Reynolds, are you sure you want to record in your report that you forced a passenger off a plane just because she refused to change seats?" A flicker of hesitation crossed his face. But it was too late. He had chosen a path of no return. "That's enough," he said. "Security will escort you off." Two security guards stepped forward, the light glinting off their uniforms. All eyes followed Aisha as she stood. She said nothing. She simply folded her jacket neatly, gathered her things, and looked straight at Captain Reynolds. "You're making a serious mistake," she said, her voice low and clear, more a warning than a reproach. Captain Reynolds did not reply. He just signaled to the security team. Aisha Monroe stepped out of the cabin, each step slow and dignified. For a moment, no one in first class dared to breathe loudly. Even James Whitmore was confused. He had never expected this scene to make him feel so small. As the plane doors closed behind her, no one knew that the real storm had just begun. Aisha stood on the gangway, her eyes looking through the glass at the still plane. Her hands gripped the phone tightly, and the voice in her head rang clearly. "Calm down. This is not about you anymore." She opened her address book, scrolling through familiar names, industry friends, FAA executives, government technical advisors. She stopped at a single name, Marcus Thorne. She pressed call. "Marcus," she said, "it's Aisha. We have a problem." On the other end of the line, a deep and calm voice replied, "Aisha, what happened? I thought you were already in the air." She looked through the glass, where Captain Reynolds was still preparing for takeoff. Her voice was low but firm. The problem was on that plane. In that moment, in the pale yellow light of the station, a thick sense of justice about to be restored rose. And the audience knew that what was coming would not just be a counterattack, but an earthquake. Dr. Aisha Monroe stood alone on the connecting bridge, the yellow lights of the terminal reflecting off her face. No one on the plane knew that she was more than just a businesswoman or a regular passenger. She was a former advisory committee member of the Federal Aviation Administration, a person with direct access to channels of communication that few others had access to. Marcus Thorne, the airport's operations director, was someone she'd worked with for years. He was the one who understood her best, how she kept her cool even when she was upset, and how once she took action, things wouldn't just stop at passenger incidents. When Marcus heard her voice, his voice immediately became serious. "Aisha, tell me everything." She recounted it briefly, detailing it clearly like a professional report: the pressuring passenger, the biased flight attendant, purser's failure to follow the rules, and the captain who ordered her off the plane without a valid safety reason. Marcus was silent for a few seconds. He knew what that meant. "Aisha," he said finally, "stay where you are. Do not leave that gate." She looked out the window. The plane was still stationary. The engine was starting slowly. The flashing green lights reflected on the runway. An announcement came over the airport loudspeaker, the voice cold. "Flight 827 is preparing for departure." She smiled faintly. "Not today," she whispered. Marcus called the airport operations center. Within 2 minutes, a string of information was transmitted to air traffic control. A message appeared on the main screen: Level 1 passenger safety violation. Hold runway clearance for Flight 827. 10 minutes. Just 10 minutes after she left the plane, all operations on Ascend Air Flight 827 were suspended. The co-pilot looked at the captain. "Sir, the tower just called. They're holding our clearance." Captain Michael Reynolds frowned. "What? Why, they didn't say, sir, just a hold order." Brenda Lawson began to worry. She felt the air in the cabin grow cold. A few passengers began whispering, wondering why the plane wasn't moving. James Whitmore looked around, his eyes confused, then leaned over and whispered to Emily Carter, "This is probably nothing, just routine checks." But Emily didn't think so. She felt like something bigger was going on. Outside, Aisha Monroe stood there, calmly observing. In her hand was her phone, and on the screen was a text message from Marcus Runway, locked, FAA online. "Stay composed." Inside the airport operations room, Marcus Thorne was speaking with an FAA representative on the emergency channel. One of the passengers on Flight 827 was Dr. Aisha Monroe. He made clear she reported an unlawful removal from an aircraft under Title 14, Section 9111. There was a brief silence. Then a voice came on the other end. "Confirm. Lock the aircraft. No takeoff until review." Marcus looked up at the screen. The plane still waiting, its engines slowing down. He let out a small breath. Aisha, he thought. They picked the wrong person to fight. Inside the plane, Captain Reynolds received a message from air traffic control. "Sir, the tower says there's an internal FAA review order on this flight. We can't move." He glared at Brenda. "What did you report to them, Brenda Bap?" "Nothing, sir. Just the passenger refused to move. Reynolds siet chatte lie." A passenger refused to move. That's it. He felt his throat dry up. Her words flashed through his mind. "Are you sure you want to write in your report that you removed a passenger for refusing to change seats?" A shiver ran down my spine. In the cabin, passengers began to lose patience. One man asked loudly, "What's going on? Why aren't we moving? Brenda Kogang Ju Bin Tin." "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a short delay due to an operational check. We appreciate your patience." But her voice trembled slightly. She clearly sensed that this was not an operational check. Meanwhile, in the control center, an emergency meeting between the FAA and Ascendair began. Marcus reported the entire incident, along with the facts about Dr. Monroe, his title, achievements, and current position on the Aviation Safety Advisory Board. The FAA representative said succinctly, "The plane isn't leaving the ground until she clears it." 10 minutes had passed since Aisha Monroe was taken off the plane. 10 minutes, enough time for the entire system to shut down. She stood by the window, watching the yellow runway lights flicker. Part of her felt sad, not because of this, but because of all the years she had tried to believe that fairness was natural. She remembered the first time, as a young engineer, she had been ignored in a boardroom because she was a black woman. She remembered the suspicious looks, the sarcastic words. But today, she was no longer the one who suffered. Today, she was the one who had the power to stop an entire runway. Marcus Goy Lai. Aisha. "Runway is locked. FAA team is heading to the aircraft. Do you want to go back?" She smiled slightly. "No. Marcus, let them come to me, inside the plane." The atmosphere was chaotic. A group of FAA inspectors boarded. Captain Reynolds looked at them, his face pale. The leader asked bluntly, "Captain Reynolds, we received a report from Dr. Aisha Monroe. Can you confirm she was removed from this aircraft?" Reynolds sighed. "Yes, she was. The reason she refused to change seats, the cabin was dead silent." The inspector made a note of something, then looked at him with an unreadable expression. "Thank you, Captain. Please shut down the engines. This flight is officially grounded pending investigation." The words cut like a cold knife. James Whitmore looked around, stunned. "Wait. What?" Grounded, Emily Carter turned to look at him, her eyes filled with disappointment. "You did this," she whispered. Brenda Lawson stood still, her hands shaking. For the first time in her 25 years of flying, she had witnessed a passenger being ejected from a plane, and the crew being investigated immediately afterward. Aisha Monroe watched from afar, the light reflecting off her face. When she saw the detective's car stop by the bridge, she knew this was no longer a personal story. It was about honor, about justice, and how the world treated those it did not understand. She adjusted her coat and walked slowly toward the security door. Her footsteps echoed softly down the long hallway, but each step felt like a beat of reclaimed power. She didn't have to raise her voice. She didn't have to get angry. Just 10 minutes. 10 minutes is enough for an entire runway to stop. The air at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta Airport was heavy. Outside, other planes continued to take off and land. But on runway through, Flight 827 stood still, a powerful silence. Dr. Aisha Monroe sat in the VIP waiting room, a cup of mint tea in front of her. The afternoon light filtered through the wide windows, reflecting on her eyes. Marcus Thorne walked in, his face still stern, but there was respect in his eyes. "Aisha," he said, "FAA is on site. They've grounded the plane and opened a full investigation." She nodded slightly. "I expected that." Marcus sat down opposite, his voice low. "You realize what you've done?" "Right. You didn't just stop a flight. You froze an entire runway." She looked at him, her eyes calm. "Sometimes, Marcus, you need to stop everything just to make people see what they've become blind to." He was silent. He knew she was right. In the world of aviation, process is much talked about, but fairness is often forgotten. Outside the window, FAA vehicles were parked in rows. Employees in high-visibility vests were milling about, holding clipboards and tablets. On the plane, Captain Reynolds was being interviewed. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his voice trembled every time he said the words "removed passenger." Brenda Lawson, the flight attendant, sat at the back of the cabin with her head down, her hands clasped together. She no longer appeared as confident as before. The image of Dr. Monroe's calm face kept appearing in her mind. She wondered if she had just listened a little longer. Maybe things would have been different. James Whitmore sat in silence, looking out the window. Emily Carter was beside him, her face full of disappointment. She said nothing, just shook her head slightly. He turned to her, intending to say something, but she only uttered a short sentence. Sometimes, power doesn't mean you're right. In the small conference room on the ground floor, the discussion between the FAA and the Ascendair representative was tense. The FAA representative's voice rang out coldly. "Captain Reynolds, your crew violated passenger rights protocol. Removing a passenger without lawful reason is a serious offense." Reynolds tried to justify. "I was trying to maintain order." But there was no disorder. Was there? Ngoi than trangat loi. There was only a woman sitting in her assigned seat. No one answered. No one dared to look at each other. Ultimately, the FAA made a temporary decision. Flight 827's crew was grounded. The flight was canceled. All passengers were rebooked. The news spread like wildfire. Some passengers left the plane, angry and confused. Some young people started filming and posting on social media. They kicked out a black woman, and now the plane's grounded. Justice served. The clips quickly went viral. Within hours, they had been viewed millions of times. In the comments, people shared stories of their own experiences of being judged because of their skin color, their gender, or simply for saying no. Aisha didn't read those comments. She didn't need to. To her, the silence of the wrongdoers was what mattered most. Marcus looked at her, his voice softening. "You know, they'll turn this into a story. The media will pick it up." She smiled faintly. "Let them. Maybe it's time people see what dignity really looks like." As the sky turned to dusk, red sunlight filtered through the glass, reflecting off the metal tag on her wrist a bracelet that read FAA Advisory Board. It glinted in the light, a reminder that true power doesn't need to shout to be recognized. An FAA officer entered the room. "Ma'am, we've concluded our preliminary review. You're cleared. They'll file the full report to Washington by morning." "Thank you," she replied, softly but firmly. She stood up, picked up her small bag, and adjusted her coat. Marcus walked beside her, and the two of them walked down the long hallway, where the dim light reflected off the floor. "An, hoi, ke. What will you do now, Ko Mim Kwoi?" "I'll do what I've always done. Marcus, keep flying, and keep reminding them that respect is not optional." Marcus chuckled. He knew that tone, calm but final. Outside, the runway was still crowded. Other planes were taking off, trailing trails of light across the purple sky, but amid the bustle, Flight 827 stood still, a quiet symbol of justice. In the VIP cabin, several Ascendair staff were called in. They apologized. They talked about failed procedures, about retraining, about unexpected incidents. Aisha listened to everything, nodded, but did not comment. When everyone left, she sat alone. The airport loudspeakers blared in the distance. A child laughed. A suitcase rolled across the floor. She closed her eyes and exhaled softly. In that moment, she felt something deeper than victory. It was liberation, not just for herself, but for all those who had been silenced. Across the hall, Brenda Lawson stepped out, her eyes wet. She paused, looking at Aisha from afar. 1 second, 2 seconds. Then she spoke softly. "Ma'am, I'm sorry." Aisha opened her eyes and looked at her. She didn't say, "I forgive." She just nodded slightly, as an acknowledgement that she had heard, and that was enough. At that moment, the two women, one scarred by prejudice, the other by regret, stood facing each other in silence. There were no more boundaries, only human beings remained. Marcus turned around, saw the scene, and smiled. He knew this was the real victory, not the grounded plane, not the headlines, but this moment of grace, not fell. Aisha left the airport through a private door, a black car waiting outside. As the car door closed, she looked out the window, watching the airport lights fade away. A voice rang out in her heart, gentle yet firm. Sometimes justice isn't loud. Sometimes it's a quiet woman who refuses to move. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight shone through the glass buildings of Los Angeles, the morning news simultaneously mentioned the name Dr. Aisha Monroe. On the big screens of television channels, the headlines flashed, "Black female CEO escorted off plane after refusing to give up seat. FAA grounds flight." The clips, filmed by passengers, went viral. In just 8 hours, they had been viewed more than 7 million times on social media. A commentator's voice can be heard in the video. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't fight back. She just stood her ground. And somehow, the entire runway stopped. In a small cafe near the airport, Marcus Thorne looked at the screen, the coffee cup in his hand shaking slightly. He smiled slightly. Aisha never liked to be the center of attention, but she always made people see the truth. On the other side of the country, in an office in Washington, D.C., a group of FAA advisors was reviewing security footage. One said quietly, "She's remarkable, calm, precise. She handled it better than most of us would have." Another nodded. "This will go into training. Every crew should see this." Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, Aisha Monroe sat in the conference room of her company, Monroe Aerotech. She maintained her usual calm demeanor, but today her eyes looked a little different, a little sad, a little determined, and a little tired. The staff entered the conference room, tablets in hand, but their gazes lingered on her longer than usual. A young woman said softly, "Dr. Monroe, we're proud of you." Aisha just smiled slightly. "Don't be proud because it went viral," she said slowly. "Be proud because we didn't let silence win." Outside, the wind blew softly through the trees. In the quiet, she remembered being led off the plane, the footsteps, the curious eyes, the silence of those who dared not speak. She wasn't angry at them. She understood the fear of being noticed, the fear of standing up against injustice, but she knew it was the silence that kept it all going. That afternoon, her phone rang. The screen read, "Good morning, America." The hosts wanted to interview her live. "America needs to hear your story," they said. Aisha was thoughtful. She didn't want to turn the situation into a media spectacle. But she understood that sometimes one person's story can help millions of others see themselves. The interview was taped the next day. The studio was brightly lit, the lights shining on her face, reflecting off her calm eyes. The host began, "Dr. Monroe, you've been called a hero, a symbol of grace under pressure. How did it feel when they asked you to leave Aisha ngung mo chut truok ki traloy?" It didn't feel heroic. It felt familiar. Ko noi. Because every black woman in America knows that moment, the moment when you have to decide whether to stay silent or to stand for yourself. The studio fell silent. The host bowed his head. And when you chose to stand, Aisha looked straight into the camera. "I didn't stand to fight. I stood to remind people that dignity isn't negotiable." The interview clip went viral shortly after it aired. The quote was shared across platforms and retweeted in thousands of posts. Dignity isn't negotiable. The quote became a hashtag, a message for countless people who had been overlooked. In a small house in Texas, a young mother watched the clip on her phone, tears streaming down her face. She turned to her little daughter, sitting next to her, and said, "See her. That's how you fight, with calm, not anger." In New York, a group of college students shared a video in a sociology class. One said, "This isn't about a seat in a plane. It's about the seats we're told we don't deserve to sit in every day." Meanwhile, in Atlanta, Brenda Lawson, the former flight attendant, sat in her small apartment. She turned on the television and saw Aisha's face on the screen. Her eyes were filled with regret and relief. She had submitted her resignation letter that morning. In the letter, she wrote, "It took one woman's calm to show me what I had stopped seeing." The story not only went viral, but also touched millions of hearts. It is not a scandal, but a reminder that self-respect does not need noise, only steadfastness. A week later, the FAA officially announced the results of its investigation. The Flight 827 crew violated passenger handling procedures, and Ascend Air would have to overhaul its training program. They called it the Monroe Protocol, a new set of guidelines for fair and respectful behavior toward passengers. As the announcement aired, Marcus Thorne texted her, "You didn't just shut down a runway, you opened a door." Aisha read the message and chuckled. She replied simply, "That's all I ever wanted." That afternoon, she drove to Santa Monica Beach. The sea was calm, the waves were gentle, the sky was blue. She sat down on a wooden bench, took off her high heels, and let her feet touch the sand. It felt warm and light. She thought about all the people who had texted, written, emailed her people who said they saw themselves in her. One man wrote, "My wife watched you," and she said, "Maybe I can speak up next time." She read those words, and her heart slowed. No more anger, just gratitude. The sea breeze blew gently through her hair. The sunset dyed the sea red. She spoke softly to herself, like a prayer. Sometimes you have to lose a seat to remind people of their humanity. Marcus called. He asked where she was. "By the ocean." She replied, "I needed quiet." He smiled through the phone. "You and quiet don't last long. The world's already calling for you again." She smiled. "Let them call. I'll answer when it matters." The sky gradually darkened. The sound of the waves mixed with the wind, creating a gentle sound. In the dim light, Dr. Aisha Monroe closed her eyes, letting peace take over. Tomorrow she would go to work again, stand before powerful people again, and talk about safety, fairness, and respect again. But tonight she was just a woman, peaceful, strong, and free. 3 months later, the name Dr. Aisha Monroe is no longer associated with aviation. It has become a symbol, a story told in classrooms, at conferences, in human rights talks. Across America, from college lecture halls to corporate seminars, the Monroe Protocol is being touted as a turning point in the history of service and human resource management, not just in aviation, but in every field that involves people. One Friday morning, Aisha was invited to speak at the National Conference on Ethics and Leadership in Washington, D.C. The auditorium was large, warmly lit, and hundreds of people were in attendance, from CEOs to faculty to students. When she stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. She wore a simple navy suit. No jewelry, no flashy appearance. Her voice was deep and clear. Each word seemed to permeate the space. People ask me how it felt to be escorted off a plane. Honestly, I was tired. Not because I was offended, but because I realized that even when you have achieved the position you once dreamed of, prejudice can still make you stand up for the obvious. Respect. The room fell silent. She paused for a moment, looking down at the front row, where Marcus Thorne sat, smiling encouragingly. "I don't act to be an icon," she continued. "I act because I know that silence normalizes wrongdoing." A round of applause broke out, not loud, but long and real. In the middle row, a young student turned to his friend and whispered, "She doesn't sound angry. She sounds free." After the speech, a middle-aged woman approached. She was a lecturer at a prestigious university in California. Her eyes sparkled as she looked at Aisha. "Your story has become a case study in our leadership course," she said. "We call it the calm storm." Aisha smiled. "That's beautiful," she replied. "A storm doesn't always need thunder." That evening, she returned to the hotel. Her room window was open, facing the Washington Monument, its light reflecting off the Potomac River. She sat down, kicked off her high heels, and relaxed. Her phone rang. The screen showed the caller ID, Brenda Lawson. Aisha hesitated for a second before picking up. Brenda's voice on the other end was shaky but sincere. "Dr. Monroe, I just wanted to thank you. I know I can't change what happened, but I'm working now with the new training team. Every week, I tell new flight attendants about that day." Aisha was silent for a moment, then said softly, "Then maybe something good came out of it after all." When the call ended, she looked out the window. The light was dim, the traffic still moving on the highway like a never-ending light. She let out a soft breath, feeling relieved. A week later, Forbes magazine published an interview headlined "Aisha Monroe, the woman who changed how America sees respect." The article focused not on the incident on the plane, but on her journey from aeronautical engineer to CEO, and then to a symbol of calm and justice. In the article, she says, "What makes a person strong is not power, but the ability to maintain dignity in moments of vulnerability." Those lines are quoted everywhere. High schools print them on bulletin boards, businesses post them in boardrooms, and people who have been overlooked, who have been misjudged, find in them something to cling to. One evening in New Orleans, a jazz group performed a new song called 10 Minutes. The lead singer introduced it's inspired by a woman who stopped a plane not with anger, but with grace. The audience fell silent as the song began somber saxophone notes, a gentle piano, and a husky voice rising, telling the story like a modern legend. Meanwhile, in Atlanta, Marcus Thorne continued his work at the airport. He still received occasional messages from Aisha, brief lines, sometimes just a photo taken from the plane window. He knew she was still flying, still working, still the same, calm and strong. One evening, he received an email from her. The subject line simply read, "Thought you'd like this." Attached was a photo from a graduation ceremony. On stage, students held their diplomas. Behind them, a large banner that read, "Dignity isn't negotiable," inspired by Dr. Aisha Monroe. He laughed loudly, then leaned back in his chair. She didn't just shut down a runway. He muttered, "She opened a generation." In Los Angeles, Aisha Monroe was preparing for her next business trip. She packed her bags and put a small notebook in her bag. Inside were a few notes she had written to herself: "Stay calm, stay kind, stay firm." As she entered the airport, the check-in staff recognized her. The young woman smiled brightly. "Dr. Monroe, it's an honor to have you fly with us." Aisha returned a small smile. "Thank you. It's good to be seen." When she walked through the security checkpoint, no one pointed, no one suspected, just an ordinary woman going about her business. But to those who knew the story, it was a picture of change, quiet but powerful. On the plane, as the engine started, she looked out the window. The sky outside was clear, white clouds rolling in layers. The flight attendant walked over, smiling professionally. "Would you like some tea?" Ma'am Aisha nodded. "Yes, please." A cup of steaming tea sat on the small table, the light reflecting off the glass, creating a thin halo. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes. In the steady sound of the engine, she could hear her heartbeat flowing smoothly, as if the universe was whispering, "You've done enough." She knew this story would be told many times in classrooms and boardrooms and courage talks, but for her, it was never a story of victory. It was simply proof that calm could be more powerful than any scream. Outside the window, the plane began to cut through the wind, heading up into the blue sky. On the ground, thousands of people lived, worked, and remembered that name. A woman was once taken off the plane, and 10 minutes later made the whole of America look at itself. It was a rainy day in Seattle. Fine raindrops pelted against the glass windows of Dr. Aisha Monroe's office. She sat alone, her laptop open, an unfinished document on the screen. Beside it was a steaming cup of mint tea and an unsent envelope. The words on the envelope were handwritten in soft ink. "To the woman I used to be." She stared at the envelope for a long time. The room was quiet except for the pattering of rain. She sighed, then began typing each line, not a report, not a speech, but a confession to herself from years ago. Dear Aisha, if you're reading this, it means you finally learned how to sit still, not just in a seat, but in yourself. I remember you, the young woman who worked twice as hard just to be seen as equal. The one who stayed late in the lab at MIT, whose hands shook the first time she presented to a room full of men who couldn't see past her skin. I remember how small you felt that day, even though your ideas were bigger than the engines you designed. You thought being excellent would be enough. But excellence, you learned, doesn't protect you from prejudice. It only exposes it. She stopped and looked out. The rain was still pouring. The city was covered in a thin mist. She smiled softly, a smile tinged with sadness, but calm. She continued writing. You didn't know then that your silence was teaching people how to treat you. You didn't know that, one day, you would have to lose your seat to find your voice. When they asked you to move that day on Flight 827, it wasn't just about a seat. It was about every meeting you were talked over, every idea someone else got credit for, every time someone called you sweetheart instead of doctor. That day, you didn't raise your voice, but you raised a standard. You didn't fight them. You simply refused to disappear. And for the first time, the world stopped not because of anger, but because of grace. Aisha stopped typing. Next to her, a small framed photo caught her eye. It was of her and Marcus Thorne at the FAA ceremony, smiling brightly. She remembered Marcus saying, "You turned a moment of injustice into a movement of dignity." She touched the photo lightly. "Maybe we both did," she whispered, on the screen. The cursor blinked as if urging her to continue writing. She took a deep breath, then wrote, "Sometimes I wonder, was it worth it? The sleepless nights, the headlines, the interviews, the way strangers looked at you like you were a symbol instead of a person. It was heavy, but yes, it was worth it. Because somewhere, a young girl watched that video and realized she never had to apologize for existing. Somewhere, a flight attendant learned to pause before judging. Somewhere, a man in a position of power asked himself why he had stayed silent. And somewhere, deep inside you, the little girl from Atlanta, the one who dreamed of building planes, finally learned she didn't need anyone's permission to take flight. She leaned back in her chair. A long, soft breath escaped her, like a sigh of resignation. Outside, the rain faded. The city was lit by streetlights reflecting off the water. She opened her desk drawer and took out an old, dark, leather-bound notebook. Inside were notes she had written years earlier, the first blueprints for the wing balance stabilizer system that would later be used in over 300 commercial aircraft. In the corner of the page was a sentence she had once scrawled, "Build things that lift others." She smiled. Maybe that's what she did not, just with planes, but with people. And the phone rang. It was Marcus. His voice, warm as always, came through the speaker. "Still working?" he asked. "Writing," she replied, but not a report this time. "A speech?" She smiled. "A letter? To whom?" "To the woman who once thought keeping quiet was strength." Marcus smiled. "I hope she listens." "She already did," she replied softly. A moment of silence passed between them. Then Marcus said, "You know, they're still talking about that day. There's a mural of you now at JFK. It says, 'Grace Under Pressure.'" Aisha laughed. "I never liked being on walls." "Too late," he said. "You're part of history now." When the call ended, she looked back at the letter. She read each line over, feeling like she was talking to herself, to the young girl who had believed that silence was the way to be accepted. She typed the last lines. "So, dear me, when they question your worth, remember you were never sitting in the wrong seat. You were sitting in the right story. And when they ask you how you stayed calm, tell them this calm is not the absence of power. It's the control of it. Keep your head high, keep your voice steady, and when the world tries to push you back to the middle seat, smile and stay exactly where you are. With love, Aisha." She read it again, then saved the document. The light from the screen fell on her face, calm, wise, and filled with peace. Outside, the rain had stopped. Streetlights cast streaks of light across the wet street. She stood up, opened the window, and took a deep breath of the after-rain air. It was fresh and clean, just like how she felt. She folded the letter, put it in an envelope, sealed it, and wrote a small line on the back to be opened again when you forget who you are. Then she turned off the lights, leaving only the small table lamp on. In the room, the only sound left was the steady ticking of the clock, mixed with the sound of the rain that had stopped. That night, Dr. Aisha Monroe went to bed earlier than usual. Her sleep was dreamless. There was only a feeling of peace, as if everything left unsaid had finally been written down. She had made peace with the past, and tomorrow she would fly again, not to escape, but to continue her journey. Like the wings she had designed, steady, light, yet strong enough to overcome any headwind. 1 year after Flight 827, Dr. Aisha Monroe took the stage at the Global Justice and Leadership Summit in New York. More than 2,000 people were in the auditorium, and millions more were watching live on television. Soft light bathed her face. On the large screen behind her, white text appeared on a deep blue background. When calm becomes courage. Marcus Thorne stood in the front row, microphone in hand, watching her with quiet pride. She had told him, "Marcus, I'll only speak again when I have something worth saying." And today was that day. She walked to the podium. Her voice was deep and warm, resonating evenly in the large space. A year ago, I was escorted off a flight because I refused to leave my seat. People called it an incident. But for me, it was a moment of awakening, not just for myself, but for everyone who has ever been silenced for acceptance. The auditorium was silent. She paused, her gaze scanning the crowd. In the middle row, a face made her pause. Captain Michael Reynolds. The captain, he sat there, hands on his knees, his face calm, his eyes filled with shame and respect. Aisha took a deep breath. She continued, "I used to think justice was something others gave me. But then I realized sometimes justice starts with you daring to stand up without anyone's permission." On the screen behind her, images from that flight flashed. The passenger video, the moment she was asked to leave her seat, and the plane being held on the tarmac. The entire audience held their breath. Then the image changed to an old interview, when she said dignity isn't negotiable. The whole room stood up and applauded. The sound was loud, like a wave. But Aisha just smiled slightly. She raised her hand, signaling for everyone to sit down. "Thank you," she said, "but this story isn't just mine. It's everyone who has been overlooked, who has been underestimated, who has been told they should stay quiet to make things easier. I don't want you to glorify me. I just want you to remember sometimes, courage doesn't need to shout. It needs to be quiet enough to stay where you are." In the middle row, Captain Reynolds bowed his head. His face was impassive. When he finished, the audience rose to their feet and applauded. But Aisha did not leave the stage. She looked at him, her eyes steady and gentle. "Captain Reynolds," she called. The room fell silent. He looked up, surprised. "Would you join me here? Please." He hesitated for a few seconds, then stood up and walked slowly toward the stage. Each step carried the weight of time and regret. When he reached the podium, Aisha returned to the audience. "This man, Ko Noi, was the captain on Flight 827. The day I was escorted off that plane, he made a decision he thought was right. But leadership isn't about never being wrong. It's about knowing when to learn." The room fell silent. Reynolds took the microphone, his voice low and trembling slightly. "She's right, Ong Noi. I thought I was maintaining order, but I was protecting comfort, not justice. I've watched that footage more times than I can count, and every time I saw less of a disruption and more of a woman who deserved respect." The entire auditorium erupted in applause. Aisha tilted her head slightly, smiling. She whispered, just enough for him to hear, "Thank you for saying that out loud." He replied, "Thank you for not hating me." The two shook hands. The light illuminated their hands, a simple handshake, but one that carried the weight of forgiveness and understanding. Marcus, in the front row, let out a soft sigh. He knew this was the real end, not when the plane stopped, but when people learned to listen to each other. After the conference, every major newspaper carried pictures of Aisha and Reynolds on their front pages. The New York Times wrote, "The woman who turned conflict into connection." The Washington Post called it a lesson in grace. That evening, Aisha and Marcus sat at a small bar in Brooklyn. The lights were yellow, and soft jazz played from the corner. He raised his glass. "To forgiveness," he said. She smiled. "To understanding," she replied. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Marcus asked, "What's next for you?" "Aisha?" She smiled. "Maybe rest, or maybe another flight." He laughed. "You never stop flying, do you?" She shrugged. "Maybe that's the point." Outside the window, a light rain was falling. The car headlights reflected off the wet road, sparkling like a streak of stars. Aisha looked out, her eyes filled with contemplation. "Marcus, ko noi ke. When I was younger, I thought freedom meant having no one tell you what to do. But now I think freedom is being at peace even when they do. An gat jiao. That's why people listen to you. You don't just talk, you make them feel." She chuckled. "Maybe because I felt it all before." Night fell, and the city was bathed in neon lights. Aisha stood up, put on her coat, ready to leave. She turned to look at Marcus. "You know, that day on the runway, I thought my world was falling apart. Turns out, it was falling into place. Marcus Mim Quoy, and you helped the rest of us find ours." She nodded and stepped outside. The night air was cool. She took a deep breath and looked up at the sky where planes flew by, leaving long trails of light like strokes of fate. Kothi Tam. Every runway leads somewhere. Sometimes it leads back to who you really are. A gentle breeze blew through. The city was alive, bustling, and vibrant. But amidst the hustle and bustle, a black woman walked quietly, calm, confident, and free. 2 years have passed since Aisha Monroe was escorted off that flight. Much has changed for her, but not in the dramatic way the media once portrayed. She is no longer the woman who appears on the front page of every newspaper. Now, she's a quiet person, choosing to create change not through speeches, but through quiet actions, the way she did in Chair 2B that year. One April morning, Aisha was in Washington, D.C., in the glass building of the National Leadership Program. Today, she was officially appointed as a special advisor to the Voices of Equity Project, a training program for fairness and respect for people, implemented in all U.S. airlines. Marcus Thorne was there, too. He walked over and shook her hand. From a runway shutdown to rewriting the rules, he said. Aisha laughed. "Sometimes you have to stop a plane to start a movement." They both walked into the conference room. The plan appeared on the screen. The Monroe Initiative, Leadership Through Empathy. She saw her name there, but she didn't feel pride. She felt only responsibility. The meeting began. Young, energetic people presented ideas for training modules identifying implicit bias, responding in a crisis, and maintaining respect and power. Aisha listened, took notes, and occasionally interjected a few comments. Mot ko ga tre jung len. Jung run hey, Dr. Monroe. I just want to say, I joined this program because of you. I was a flight attendant when your story happened. It changed how I see people. The room fell silent. Aisha smiled and nodded. "Then you already understand the heart of leadership," she said. "It's not about controlling others. It's about creating space for them to be seen." After the meeting, she went out onto the balcony overlooking the National Mall. The cherry trees were in full bloom, petals fluttering in the wind. Marcus stood beside her, holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to her. "Do you ever miss the quiet life on Hoi, Ko Nin Sha Sham?" "Sometimes. But then I remember. Quiet didn't change much. Speaking did. On Gat Jiao. You know, they're planning to include your story in the National Museum of African American History. Koke Koi. I guess I'm officially history now." He looked at her. "No, Aisha, your legacy." That evening, she flew to Chicago to meet a group of students at Northwestern University. The hall was small but cozy. Students crowded around her, asking all sorts of questions: how she kept her composure. Was she scared? Did she have any regrets? "I am calm, not because I am not afraid," she said. "I am calm because I know that fear will not make me right." When you control your reaction, you take back the power to tell your own story. A student asked, "Dr. Monroe, what did that experience teach you the most?" She paused for a moment and then replied, "That power comes not from where you sit, but from why you sit there." After the talk, she received a small note. A young woman, a student of color, had scribbled, "Thank you for showing me that calm doesn't mean weak. It means powerful enough to choose peace." Aisha read that sentence over and over again, feeling her nose sting. The next day, she returned to Los Angeles. In the office of Monroe Aerotech, she sat before a large window overlooking the city. In the corner of the room, the model airplane she had designed early in her career still sat on a wooden shelf. She walked over, brushed off the dust, and said softly, "You've carried more than passengers. You've carried lessons." Marcus video called from Atlanta. He was at the airport, and behind him was a new plane with the logo Ascend Air. In partnership with the Monroe Initiative, he smiled. "You see that they named the new aircraft after you." She laughed, half joking. "Then it flies smoother." "Ah, no, it will, because it was built on the right foundation, respect." Aisha looked at him longingly through the screen, then nodded slightly. "That's all I ever wanted, Marcus, just a little more respect in the sky." When the call ended, she sat down and opened the old leather notebook she always carried with her. Inside, on the last page, she wrote one more line: "Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you lift while you're still here." Late afternoon, the golden sunlight fell obliquely through the glass window. She stood up, put on her coat, and left the office. Outside, the sunset dyed the sky red. The sound of the airplane engines echoed in the distance, mingling with the wind. She raised her head to look after him, her eyes shining with quiet pride. No more pain, no more anger, just a sense of peace, knowing that every step she took, no matter how small, left footprints for others to easily walk over. Somewhere in the sky, a young woman is flying, maybe a flight attendant, maybe a passenger, maybe someone who never knew her name. But in their hearts, Aisha Monroe's story lives on, not as a legend, but as a gentle reminder that dignity is non-negotiable and respect is the starting point of every journey. The sky in Los Angeles that morning was unusually clear. The soft yellow sunlight covered the runway, reflecting off the planes lined up waiting for takeoff. Dr. Aisha Monroe stood in front of the large glass doors of the VIP area, suitcase in hand. She was about to fly to Atlanta, her hometown, where it all began. It had been 2 years since she last flew with Ascend Air, and now she was back, not as a passenger, but as a living symbol. When the flight call came on, she took a deep breath and walked to the counter. The staff member smiled brightly. "Welcome aboard, Dr. Monroe. We're honored to have you." Aisha returned the call with a small smile. "Thank you. It's good to be back." She stepped onto the gangway, feeling a strange sensation. The sound of the engine, the smell of recycled air, the sound of passengers' shoes hitting the floor, all of it brought her back to that day. The day she was asked to leave her seat, the day everything changed, but today was different. Today, everyone recognized her, not with suspicion, but with respect. As she entered first class, the chief flight attendant approached, bowing slightly. "Dr. Monroe, this flight is special because of you. We wouldn't be who we are today without your story. Aisha K. Mim Koi. I'm just glad to see that respect can fly higher than pride." She sat down on chair 2B, the same spot as before. Her hand lightly touched the armrest, the cool metal feeling making her feel like she was touching the past. Everything was the same, but the people were different. As the plane began to taxi, and the captain's voice came over the intercom. His voice was deep, clear, and a little emotional. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is your captain speaking. My name is Michael Reynolds, and before we take off, I'd like to dedicate this flight to someone sitting among you, Dr. Aisha Monroe. 2 years ago, she reminded us what dignity truly means. Today, she reminds us that growth begins with humility. Thank you, Dr. Monroe, for teaching us to fly better." The cabin fell silent. Then there was applause. A few passengers stood up, turned to look at her, and smiled. She nodded her head in thanks, a quiet, warm feeling rising in her heart. Flight attendant Brenda Lawson was also on the flight. She approached, her eyes brimming with tears. "I never thought I'd see you here again," she said. Aisha looked at her, her eyes kind. "Neither did I. But I guess life gives us second chances when we're ready to learn. Brenda Nam Te Ko. You changed my life. Dr. Monroe. After that day, I decided to stay in aviation, but never in silence. Ko Jap. That's all I ever hoped for. Brenda. Not to be remembered, but to make people remember what matters." The engine noise increased. The plane began to lift off the ground, slowly rising through the white clouds. Aisha looked out the window and saw the sun rising, its bright light an affirmation that every beginning has a reason. As the seatbelt sign turned off, a small, brown-skinned girl walked past her, holding a comic book. The girl stopped and looked at her for a long time. "Are you the lady from the airplane story?" Aisha laughed and nodded. "Maybe. What do you think that story is about?" She tilted her head, thinking. "About being brave?" Aisha smiled. "Close. It's about knowing who you are, even when people forget." The little girl smiled back, then ran back to her seat, her curly hair bouncing with her steps. Aisha watched, her heart as light as a cloud. The flight lasted 4 hours, but for her, time passed more quickly than usual. She thought about the years that had passed, about the perseverance, the misunderstandings, the hurts, and the people who had changed along with her. She remembered her conversation with Marcus the night before. He'd said, "You know, Aisha, people remember the moment you were escorted off that plane, but I'll remember the 10 minutes after when you stayed calm and everyone else fell apart." She laughed. "Those 10 minutes cost me everything, but they gave me everything too." As the plane descended, the captain spoke again. "Ladies and gentlemen, as we approach Atlanta, I want to share one last thought. Sometimes it only takes one calm voice to remind the world to listen." Aisha closed her eyes. Tears fell softly, not because of sadness, but because she knew that her journey had come to an end. The plane touched down smoothly on the runway. When the doors opened, people stood up, but not in a hurry. Many approached her, shook her hand, said thank you. She stepped off the plane, the midday light illuminating her face. At the bottom of the stairs, Marcus was waiting. He smiled, holding a small bouquet of flowers. "Welcome home, Dr. Monroe." She stepped down, smiling back. "Feels like the first flight all over again." "And Noi. Except this time, you're not being escorted off, you're being celebrated." They left the airport together, outside. The Atlanta sky was a brilliant, deep blue, as if no storm had ever passed through. In the car, Aisha opened the window, the wind blowing through her hair. Marcus asked, "So what now?" She looked away. "Now I live, I teach, I rest, and maybe I write." He smiled. "A book." She nodded, not about what happened, about what it meant. On the freeway, the car sped forward. In the distance was a large sign that read, "Atlanta International Airport, home of the Monroe Initiative. Aisha Nhien. Ke Koi. Funny, Ko Noi. It started with me losing a seat. And now, there's a place named after it, Marcus Jap. Sometimes, you have to lose one seat to make room for a generation." They were silent together, and the sunlight shone through the glass windows, bathing them both in a warm, gentle light like forgiveness. As the car passed over the bridge, Aisha looked up at the sky where a plane was taking off. She whispered, "Fly safe." And in that law, the image of the black woman who was once let off a plane, who once stopped an entire runway, has now become a symbol of what the world sometimes forgets. That calm can change the sky. 10 years after Flight 827 was detained, Atlanta International Airport has a new arrivals hall. On the large wall in front of the boarding gate, a shiny brass plaque is prominently mounted in honor of Dr. Aisha Monroe, whose calm grounded a flight and lifted a generation. Passengers stopped, read, and took pictures. They didn't know the whole story, only that this woman had done something that made America look back at itself. That morning, the gentle sunlight filtered through the thick glass, shining on the face of Marcus Thorne, now the vice president of the Civil Aviation Authority. He sat on a waiting chair. In front of him was a memorial board. In his hand was an old letter, a letter Aisha had written to herself many years ago. Her voice echoed in his memory. Calm isn't the absence of power, it's the control of it. He chuckled. Now, those words have become a guiding principle for a generation of pilots, flight attendants, and leaders. As the clock struck 10, a group of high school students were ushered into the exhibit. A young teacher stopped in front of the bronze plaque and read the inscription aloud. She turned to the students and said, "This is not just about flying. It's about standing for what's right even when you have to sit." A girl in the group raised her hand. Was she scared? The teacher smiled. Maybe. But courage isn't about not being scared. It's about staying seated when fear tells you to stand. In the corner of the room, Marcus listened quietly, his eyes shining with emotion. He looked out the window, where a plane had just taken off, its fuselage emblazoned with the logo of the Monroe Initiative, a program Aisha had started that had become a global standard. In Los Angeles, the Monroe Aerotech office still stands. In a high-rise room, early morning light streams through the glass windows, illuminating an old photo frame. It shows Aisha Monroe smiling with her team, her hand resting on a model of the first plane the company ever built. A young employee walked in, a folder in hand. "We finished the new training module, sir," he said to the new director, a brown-skinned woman in her 30s. She smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "Good. Let's make sure it honors her spirit." On her desk, there's a framed copy of the famous quote, "Dignity isn't negotiable." She looked at the words and took a deep breath. "We'll keep flying her way," she whispered. That afternoon, Marcus left the airport and drove through downtown Atlanta. The car radio played a replay of Aisha's old interview. Sometimes, the most powerful act of resistance is to stay seated, to refuse to shrink so others can feel taller. Her voice was as light as the wind, but each word carried weight. He remembered the day he saw her off at the airport, the afternoon when the sunlight was red as fire. She smiled and said, "Marcus, promise me one thing. Never let the next person fight alone." I promised. And today, when I looked out the window and saw the planes that said, "Fly with respect," I knew I kept my word. In the sky, the plane flew through the thin clouds, leaving a long trail of light. In the front row, a little girl about 8 years old looked out the window and asked her mother, "Mom, who's Dr. Monroe?" The mother smiled. "She's the reason we can sit anywhere we belong." "Baby." The little girl nodded, her eyes lighting up, then turned back to her chair, placed a small notebook on the table, and began writing. "One day, I'll build planes too." In midair, the plane continued to fly through the white, peaceful clouds. The pilot announced over the loudspeaker, "We're flying at 35,000 feet. The weather ahead is clear," and in that moment, perhaps somewhere in the sky, the spirit of Aisha Monroe was still smiling. Not in glory, but in the knowledge that, at last, humanity had learned to fly, with respect, compassion, and dignity. That evening, at the Smithsonian, a small ceremony was held. People gathered around a bronze statue of Aisha sitting in a chair, her hands in her lap, her gaze fixed straight ahead, calm, determined, and full of faith. Marcus stepped up to the podium. His voice was low and slow. "She once told me that calm is the hardest kind of strength because it asks you to believe that you're enough, even when the world tells you otherwise." Today, we remember not just her courage, but her stillness. In a world that rushes to react, she reminded us to pause, to think, to choose grace. He paused, looking around the room. In the front row sat Brenda Lawson, now an instructor at the Flight Academy. Beside her sat Captain Michael Reynolds, his hair silver, his eyes sparkling with pride. Brenda wiped away her tears. Reynolds nodded slightly. Marcus continued. "She didn't just shut down a runway. She opened a path for all of us. And if you ever sit in seat 2B, remember that seat once held more than a passenger. It held a revolution." The whole room stood up and applauded loudly. The light fell on the bronze statue, making it sparkle like real life. After the ceremony, Marcus went outside. The night sky was covered with stars. He looked up and said to himself, "You did it, Aisha. You really did." A gentle breeze blew by, carrying flower petals that fell onto the steps. In that moment, he thought he heard her voice, gentle, warm, drifting in the wind. "Every seat is a story. make yours count. And so the story ends, not with a bang, but with the eternal silence of a woman who taught the world that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in standing up, but in daring to sit still, proud and unyielding in the face of injustice. Dr. Aisha Monroe. His story is not just about a flight, but about a journey of self-respect. She didn't scream, she didn't react violently, but her calmness made an entire system stop and look at itself. That's the power of calm, the kind of power that doesn't have to be loud, but can change the world. The biggest lesson from this story is dignity is non-negotiable. In any situation, when you know your worth, you will no longer fear being judged, rejected, or discarded, because true respect begins with you. For older people, the story reminds us that perseverance, tolerance, and forgiveness are sometimes more powerful than any excuse. When we choose to be calm instead of reactive, to listen instead of accusing, we teach the next generation a lesson in dignity and compassion, something that modern society sometimes forgets. And if you feel moved or find yourself in this story, please like, share, and subscribe. Each of your shares not only spreads a touching story, but also sends a powerful message. Respect and understanding are the true wings that help people fly high.